moving on to the next one, I would like to welcome Chris Byrnes. He is an expert lawyer in Web3 and DAOs, who is also the founding member of our WOW DAO. And with him on stage, I would like to invite James. He actually made it to the studio. I very much appreciate that. I will leave it up to Chris for a proper introduction. I personally can say I'm very honored to actually have James with me here in the studio. You have been instrumental over the last year in figuring out what we can do, what should we do, what options we have to create a proper long-term viable DAO for the AI community. So with that, Chris, welcome from Spain, beautiful Spain, Madrid. And as the co-founder, founding member of the WOW DAO, I will give it over to you.
Great, many thanks, Thomas. And it's such a pleasure to be here, and really great to see you, James and Yev. I've had the privilege of really, I think, just getting to know James and Yev over the past year, much like the rest of us, actually, as the one really cool thing we'll be talking about DAOs in general, and with WOW DAO in particular. None of us among the co-founders, I think, knew each other at all before coming together in sort of this enterprise, this project that we're doing. And much in the same way, it's through these new experimental means of organizing people and intellectual property, and really figuring out ways to co-create AI that lawyers like Yev, James, and I get to connect and sort of meet across different fields of law that each of us practice. As Thomas mentioned, a lot of my practice now is focused in Web3, specifically in the decentralized science space, but I'm an IP lawyer, intellectual property lawyer, really by sort of core in practice, a registered patent attorney, and I've worked across big tech for a handful of years. I was doing litigation, patent litigation at the International Trade Commission. I then was doing working at RPX, an entity called Rational Patent Exchange that is responsible for sort of, I think, the highest volume of patent licensing in the world, and services pretty much every big tech company we can think of, including those of many of our affiliates here. And after that, I sort of shifted to this experiment in Web3 and really became fascinated by the new technologies that we have legally, and of course through blockchain. And with this, tokenized intellectual property has become something I'm especially interested in. And that led me to also come to understand both Yev and James's pioneering work in solving for corporate form, and thinking about ways in which cooperatives can be very useful vehicles for organizing DAOs, decentralized organizations, and digital networks more generally. So it's just a real privilege to get to chat today with Yev and James. We're going to be talking about things like securities issues that come up from the SEC. I'm sure everyone has seen the news that's often coming out about crypto, and it really makes an uphill battle for a lot of us working on, I think, serious issues with a lot of public good potential. And then all of a sudden, we see all these sort of, bad news sometimes, a bad picture emerging from the amount of regulatory scrutiny. But with that, there's a lot of interesting things, I think, for us to dive into in exploring what the rationale is behind regulatory scrutiny and Web3 generally now, especially as that may interface with both DAOs and artificial intelligence. And then we can chat, I think, a lot about what a Web3 version of a lot of these sort of Web2 models that we're familiar with might look like. But let me hand it over to you, Yev and James, if you could maybe provide a bit about your background, and in particular some color on your sort of focus in Web3 and what brought you here. And maybe Yev, if you would like to begin, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is really on the cusp of a lot of different legal issues that are coming to the fore, and it's exciting to be able to talk about them. It's exciting to talk about the intersection of AI and Web3 as well. I've been in the Web3 space since 2016. I've been a practicing attorney for 15 years now. And it continues to evolve. It continues to mature. There's so many challenging topics that come up that we have to try to noodle through and do our best to advise competently on amidst kind of a background of a very uncertain regulatory climate here in the US. But my kind of expertise is rooted in corporate and securities law. We advise projects and companies on corporate formation, structuring, and compliance in terms of securities and regulatory. Have been working in the DAO cooperative space since about 2019, and we set up the first DAO cooperative out of Colorado using the LCA law here and the LCA structure, which is actually really flexible and has so much overlap in terms of values and principles in more decentralized communities. And I know that we'll talk about that throughout the session here today. But yeah, just really excited to be here. Thank you very much for this great panel. I'll hand it over to James.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Yev. And I have to say, Yev, before we get too deep into this, you and the folks at Jason Weiner law firm have been so inspiring in really bringing the cooperative form into the Web3 space. And so kudos to you and your colleagues for doing so much of that hard work. So again, my name is James Wigginton. I am an attorney at the law firm Orrick. Orrick is an international law firm with a focus on technology companies and securities transactions and energy, interestingly enough. My focus is on securities law. I was raised as a securities lawyer, mergers and acquisitions attorney. And then I really turned my attention to the Web3 space, interestingly, because of sports. Fan ownership is an important topic in the United States right now. It's probably more fraught in the US than it is in Europe or in other jurisdictions. And so I started thinking about user ownership from that perspective. But many of the principles that Yev and her colleagues pioneered in the cooperative space apply directly, not only in sports, but also in Web3. So my bridge to the space was through sports. And now it really focuses on any type of business that has a large user base, where users can organize to become co-owners of a business. And so it's very much central to the Web3 ethos and central to what I do.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much both for these great introductions. I'm curious, as I would love to hear from both of you about what are the primary risks that your clients come to you to solve, on a day-to-day basis. What does your Web3 practice look like? And specifically, I'd love to hear sort of why you think these risks are the ones that are there, sort of what's happening to the extent these risks are different from risks outside of Web3. To what extent are we having to deal with new risks in the regulatory space, both in corporate form and in securities, and what might those look like for you? James would love to hear maybe from you on this one first.
Sure, you bet. Yeah, so it's interesting because I think the risk profile of every client is different. I think though that there are some commonalities, and one of the key commonalities is just the difficulty of issuing a token if you're in the Web3 space in the United States. It has become extremely difficult. It has become extremely expensive. And the primary drivers for the expense, I think, are the securities law analysis. The US Securities and Exchange Commission has been aggressive over the past couple of years, especially under Gary Gensler, with respect to the classification of tokens as securities. And because of that, token issuers who want to deal in the United States have to be extremely cautious. And the analysis that we have to do as attorneys to make sure that they can issue a token safely can take quite a lot of time. So the securities law issue is an important thing. Another issue is anti-money laundering. So anti-money laundering is a big issue in the United States. So many tokens that are issued in the United States or to US pure persons are what are called convertible virtual currencies. And if your token is a convertible virtual currency, you can fall under the jurisdiction of FinCEN, which is the US Department of Treasury's financial money laundering cop. So I would say that those are two of the key drivers that make it really tricky for people who are, who have founded companies in the US or even outside of the US to try to break into the US market. And so we really do spend a lot of our time just trying to direct clients the best way to go to work within those regulations and to structure their projects in a beneficial way.
Yeah,
I would definitely echo that as well. And I mean, James and I are both securities attorneys, so it's like putting a knife or a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon. Everything kind of takes a lens from a securities law perspective in Web3. But just to add to that, from the perspective of DAOs and cooperatives, and using the cooperative form to properly organize DAOs, it's really preserving good governance and just active participation, transparency. The governance piece has been difficult, I think, a lot across a lot of DAOs. There's definitely kind of this generally optimistic sense in initially structuring them, and then down the line issues in governance do come up, and that everything from reaching quorum to passing decisions to deploying treasury capital and funds, and kind of paralysis around decisions. So figuring out ways that just the Web2 analog legal structures like co-ops, like LLCs, like DAO LLCs and corps can really help and kind of push that further on the digital level, on the smart contract level, and making sure that the bridge is properly kind of captured in the more traditional documents.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense, and the governance piece. I'm not sure how many DAOs either of you are actively involved in. I think I'm in way too many Discord servers, but because of the work in decentralized science and this bio-DAO ecosystem, I'm pretty active in maybe 7 or 8, which is certainly on the high end. But in every single one, we've rolled into governance problems, even those that get a lot of positive attention, and so it's been fun too with WowDAO, trying to solve for take lessons learned from what we've done in DAOs, and we'll be chatting at the conclusion of today, presenting some of the models that we're intending to pursue with WowDAO. I hope folks watching will stick around for that. It's very relevant, I think, this conversation. But one of the things that I think led me to both of your work in the first instance was the power of cooperatives to issue memberships and to sell memberships, and of course, please correct me if I misstate this, but have memberships that represent both governance and economic rights in something that perhaps could be digitized into a tokenized membership or something. And to have that with those economic rights attached, potentially find some exceptions from at least certain securities regulations on account of I think 70 plus maybe no action letter precedent from the SEC. I'm probably getting those numbers wrong, but I know something in that order. Would love to hear a little more from you about what why are cooperatives sort of useful tools for organizing DAOs? How do these exceptions and limitations to securities regs around cooperatives in particular, you think sort of provide an intriguing advantage for DAOs to potentially use co-ops as a structure? And whoever, I guess, would like to, I can't wait to hear from both of you on this. So.
I can quickly just provide an overview on the securities exemption piece, and then James, maybe you want to go into just utility and patronage. But from at the state level, Chris, you're right. Membership interest, at least in Colorado and a number of other states that follow suit. The membership interests in cooperatives for patron members, which are members that actually use or derive some kind of value from the co-op, those are exempt. At the federal level, they're not even considered securities. So under United Housing versus Foreman, because of this kind of active participation or activity, and not meeting that Howey test prong of relying on the efforts of others, they don't even fall into the category of securities. So I think that's really kind of a novel little pocket that exists in securities laws. And, we've generally had approval at the state level or support at the state level that this exists, that this should somehow be safeguarded, but really hoping that, Gary is not listening and this doesn't get tested at the federal level. But as James pointed out in his paper, which was wonderful, there are these 70 plus no action letters that do exist at the SEC level. So.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate a little bit on what you said, Yev. I think one of the things that I find happens a lot when we talk with people about cooperatives in Web3 is they ask, what the heck is a cooperative? We don't know what a cooperative is. And honestly, that's on us, right? That is the legal community's problem, because we have not done a good job explaining to people what cooperatives are. I think that, if I had to define a cooperative, it is simply a business that is owned by its users. That's all it is. It's a business that's owned by its users. Just like a corporation, a traditional corporation or LLC is a business that's owned by financial investors. A cooperative is a business that is owned by the people who use the business's product or who create the business's product. And that feeds directly into the securities law analysis that Yev mentioned, right? This idea that if I am getting a benefit from my own efforts, then under US federal securities laws, that does not constitute an investment interest or an interest that would be a security under US law. So it's really about the interaction of the owners with the business. And I think a lot of DAOs are structured naturally like cooperatives, right? There's this idea that if I participate in the DAO, if I vote, if I provide some sort of a service, that I should be rewarded for that. If you think about it, a lot of layer ones are organized that way as well, right? If I provide validation services, then I get a token. And we as a community own the layer one in a way. And so again, a lot of Web3 businesses are sort of naturally formed like cooperatives, and the legal community can offer a legal structure, an actual legal cooperative that accomplishes many of those goals.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Sorry, just one clarification. So what I didn't mention is, to the kind of exemption and the classification of it not being a security does exist for these patron members, as James said as well. But if you do have investor members in your cooperative, they are treated the same just because they take on more of this passive role. So you can have multi-stakeholder cooperatives that bring in investors that infuse some kind of capital, but they typically, are not these kind of participating members. They can hold membership in multiple classes as well. but generally, they take on more of a passive role. So you would have to seek an exemption from securities registration as well.
Right. The definition of a cooperative as a business owned by its users has such a strong appeal to me as an IP lawyer, because intellectual property law, and in particular copyright law, is so sticky that it's designed to make every person on the planet, or at least everyone who's a member of the WTO or who lives in a country that's a party to the Berne Convention, these copyright treaties, that we're automatically producing intellectual property as copyright all the time, right? The minute we scratch any creative expression into any form of medium, we become essentially a property owner. And when I think about cooperatives and ways in which cooperatives can be used to pool intellectual property and to create opportunities and networks, especially when digitized and tokenized, for a community of people who retain ownership over something as powerful as their intellectual property and organize themselves around that notion of self, IP producers, something like this, we end up with a framework, I think, that can be really revolutionary for how innovation and technology develops, where I think WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, estimates that intangible assets, non-cash, meaning really things protected by intellectual property, are now worth over $70 trillion in the global economy and constitute normally 80% or something of the balance sheet of Fortune 500 companies. So we've seen this IP asset class over the past really just 40 years or so blow up to just this enormous value in the modern sort of services economy. And of course, when we talk about AI, we're hardly talking about anything from a property perspective that isn't intellectual property. And I think this becomes really exciting because so many of just the controversies, and I won't speak about any specific cases here, but generally speaking, we just have this open question of, well, one, what is data? Is data intellectual property or isn't it? And this has been something that a lot of big tech companies have spent a lot of money lobbying on, to say that no, data is something different because otherwise the users are going to own copyright. But when we get to AI now, we're seeing that only goes so far. And when AI wants to scrape creative expression and be trained on creative expression, we're unavoidably intersecting with AI in ways that we really haven't before in the Web2 world, when it was about extracting metadata, things that maybe weren't copyright protected. Now we're right in the guts of copyright protection. And so we're seeing this creates a crisis inside the copyright system. And that's how a lot of IP lawyers and academics, we talk about this as, how's this going to play out? So with this in mind, I'm curious if you all could maybe share some thoughts, speculations on what, Midjourney or OpenAI or some of these other popular platforms might look like if they actually were organized as a cooperative in a DAO where the users, the contributors of all this creative expression, so I'm thinking, oh, they're going to organize as copyright producers here as well. But what might that look like? Do you think that a co-op and a DAO model for these could potentially be viable? Would love to hear either of you. I'd see James nodding his head, so maybe I'll ask you, James, to share some thoughts first.
Because I'm excited. This is a really interesting topic, and I think if you'll indulge me with a sports analogy, because we talked about how I got into this area with sports. So let's talk about the Bundesliga. The Bundesliga is the German football league. And in the German football league, 51% of every team has to be owned by the fans. 49% has to be owned or can be owned by investors. What's really interesting about the Bundesliga is it's extremely well run. Fan participation is extremely high, and the ticket prices are also some of the lowest in Europe. Now contrast that with the Premier League. The Premier League teams are generally 100% investor owned, and they have great participation. I just went to a Premier League game when I was in England in May. It was fantastic, but the tickets were extremely expensive, and it's more difficult to participate. It's more expensive to participate than it would be in the Bundesliga. Now, I think the reason there are such great differences between these two leagues is because of the ownership structure. In the Bundesliga, you've got an ownership structure that accommodates the users of the product. The users of the product actually control the product. And because of that, there's not such a strong incentive to charge outlandish prices. More people can participate, more people can be engaged, more people can enjoy the product because of the way that the product is owned. And I think this ties right back into AI. It ties right back into Web3. We need to be able to have structures where the users of the product, or also the creators, can be co-owners of the product. Now, I'm not saying that investors don't play a huge role. They do. With any of these large language models, with any Web3 product, you have to have capital to get it started. What we're suggesting is that as the business grows, the users of the business, the users of the large language model, the creators of intellectual property are able to take an ownership interest similar to the ownership interest that fans have in the Bundesliga. So there's this shared ownership, there's this balance between investment capital and the users. And there are easy ways to do this. It's actually not as hard as you might think. And right now at Orrick, we're in the process of trying to really make that known. We want people to know that they can share ownership with their users in AI and Web3 and really in any other industry vertical in a way that is clean and simple, so that everybody can enjoy the benefits of the products that they use.
Yeah, I love the actually the analogy to Bundesliga. It makes me want to continue as I get in trouble in parts of Spain for bringing in ownership structure inside Spanish football right now, and ethical controversies that have been arisen. But se acabó, as they say here. I think another thing that really excites me about cooperative structure and more decentralized ownership pulls on the points Mikal was making around the need for there to be a space, a platform for healthier culture, more ethical culture to emerge, and more law. And while I think we're so accustomed to relying on administrative agency regulatory frameworks to do a lot of work in protecting public policy and public welfare, Web3, in my mind, also offers us and invites us into a new opportunity to create far more robust private legal systems and networks that can actually be positive in further advancing the same goals for why we have regulators to begin with, right? This public interest with intellectual property in particular. We're invited with tokenized intellectual property to define our own terms and conditions upon which we want our IP to be commercialized. So now all of a sudden we have this opportunity through tokenization and really through AI and the ability to sort of language match, people can begin to articulate IP ethics, terms of creation for terms upon which one may be allowed to commercialize the IP in a supply chain. And you think if all of a sudden all IP producers were to say, you can't use my IP in supply chains that contribute X to climate change. Well, wow, you organize everyone, let's just say, then you have $70 trillion worth of IP economic value that's now backed up for those who don't, sort of advance climate justice issues, whatever it may be. And I think it's just my analogy back to Spanish soccer is, I think that there's a reckoning that people are having culturally everywhere, where we see when there is too much of a, what has been the traditional, more corporate model, top-down power dynamics, we end up with ethical outcomes and abuse of power that, oftentimes just leave us feeling bad and thinking, can't there be a better way? And with that, I really the model that you're describing and the ways in which we can do this through, a distributed ledger technology and a means for co-ownership just seems really, really powerful to me. And Yev, I know you've worked with, helped to set up a number of DAOs who are, I think, already deploying this cooperative model. Are there any particular ones that really excite you in terms of how they've implemented their model or anything like that? I don't mean to ask specifically about clients if you don't want to speak to them, but any use case generally that you've seen that puts this model into practice. It'd be great to hear a little bit about thoughts of what has gone well and where there continue to be growing pains for everyone sort of following this model.
Yeah, I mean, I think, generally kind of in keeping in line with co-ownership and value creation and data sovereignty, the clients that we've worked with have been able to sort of create these more like flat governance structures. And out of that, I think has arisen, this prominence of data, like platform co-ops, data co-ops, and data DAOs, right? Where really there's true ownership and control over the kind of the information, the kind of systems that are being built out and, potentially feeding into LLMs. The AI and kind of Web3 intersection is really only just developing. So, we're kind of in early stages with projects that are talking about how to kind of maximize that utility and just setting up. So I won't talk about those, but some of the clients that Jason Weiner PC has worked with are one is Savvy Co-op, and they're all about health data and any kind of these kind of sessions that are created where there's health data that's being kind of proctored and put into the mix. It's very similar to kind of this data ownership structure. So yeah, I mean, there's generally a model for it, and I think that that's developing with more digital co-ops and tokenized kind of patronage activity, which is something that we've really seen become popular over the last couple of years. But creating that kind of economy where there's actually value that you could trade in, where you can sort of absorb that into that ecosystem, into that walled garden, is incentivizing folks in a way that we don't have with Web2, or that we've seen kind of more broadly on at larger DAO levels as well. So kind of coming back to my initial point about incentivization, governance, and activity. But if that's done right, and you actually see kind of gains on that usage and activity, then it seems to maintain that alignment and keeps people developing it further. So, we're only, again, at the very early stages, and, curious to see how this all develops in the next couple of years, and how much utility there is out of the data that's being created.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, data DAOs are really, really fascinating to me as well. Yeah, James, are there particular DAOs that have been really exciting for you to track or to be involved with?
So, we at Orrick help to form DAOs, help to get them up and running and get their tokens, get their tokens in shape. I think that what's been interesting to watch is how the thinking changes over time. And I think this is probably true of many DAOs, but you sort of start off with an idea of how tokenomics are going to work, how governance is going to work. And I think sometimes when the rubber meets the road, it can be kind of difficult to implement plans. I would say what's been really interesting and most engaging for me is trying to help DAOs sort of reframe how they're doing things and to simplify. I think that's probably been the most the most rewarding part of working with DAO governance is trying to introduce these legal concepts that allow people to simplify governance and make it something that is comprehensible and make it something that is easy. Because I think we noted earlier that DAO governance can be extremely challenging, and there can also be participation problems. And so the easier we can make that, for clients and for non-clients is, I think there's real benefit there. So I think that's been one really rewarding aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny on the governance piece. It similarly is just so front and center. Really, the primary issue that seems to be where friction arises. I mean, I guess just like in any other work I've done, but you see it come so front and center in DAOs because everything has to be publicly governed, and then all of a sudden conversations that one might typically have behind closed doors in order to help, get perspectives out with less friction are done in a public forum, and that can have all types of unintended, in many instances that I see, negative effects because it's too much of seeing how the sausage is made and too many people with divergent interests. So much so, I before law school, before becoming an IP lawyer, I actually was in divinity school, and I used to organize a lot of interfaith dialogues and spent half a decade kind of working on these things. And when I work with DAOs, they invite me in because I have this IP expertise, but all the time I feel like my interaction is actually going back to it's like running intercultural dialogues and trying to figure out how to get people with very different ideas to come together and co-create. And yeah, I just completely agree. For those, I think we do have in our audience today a number of people who will be in a DAO for the first time, if assuming they join WoW DAO. And questions that initially arise are, okay, well, shouldn't, kind of looking for a clean solution, a tightly run ship, the things that you want in a good startup. And then it's like, we're a start, these are all startups, but they grow in completely different directions in terms of, I think, at least in my experience, for how to align ultimately the interests so that they can grow well in a decentralized means, and not grow in a way that grows out and then allows people to rug the whole group and centralize and cash out, and this just seems to be human behavior. And also in every DAO I've been in, you see the little people making moves. But with this, we've been talking about all of the power that AI has and that it promises as a tool for us as individuals and as collectives, I think, to put to service for whatever we may want. And Thomas, Ha, Prasanna, and I, the sort of four people who've really been working to launch WoW DAO, were joking a little while ago about saying, one of the first products we should build is to make AI the CEO. Right. And we just got us thinking, like, right, how amazing would it be if we could have that governance, the layers of hierarchy that exist inside typical form that we need in order to make an organization work, if we could have that be programmed and largely organized through AI and still have something sort of move in a healthy direction, would just be wonderful. And would love to get your thoughts both on what you think of that. Do you see a space for AI to help solve some of the governance problems that we're addressing? And might there also be other ways in which AI can be used to sort of, hate to say it, for us as lawyers who make our living off of helping to support and launch these things, but for so many DAOs, it's legal fees that become prohibitive in certain points of evolution. Do you see AI in this role and in our interest in scaling patterned behavior legally and sort of creating open access law as something that could be good or bad for DAOs? Would love to get your thoughts. And maybe Yev, if you would want to share first, it'd be great to hear.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think certainly as far as cooperatives, I have some hesitation in using AI um, to really kind of fuel decision making and governance. I think, potentially there may be issues with democratic member control and autonomy, independence. And again, it depends on how these AI models are initially created and seeded. But to me, that sort of carves away, a lot of that human decision making in cooperatives that is meant for the humans that use it. So I think that I would probably be a little bit more hesitant in standing behind that. I think that AI, as far as data or kind of some kind of other commodity that's within the co-op itself that is, having this kind of mutualistic purpose, I very much am behind and support. As far as your second question, in terms of open law, I'm very much for that. I think that these kind of ivory towers that we've created with the legal system it's time to bring them down. They're outdated, and I think that people should be able to empower themselves with this body of legal knowledge that's out there. I mean, there's always going to be a place for a lawyer, for a human, to do the analysis, and I don't know that maybe generative AI will get there, but not for a long time. But I think as far as like tapping into that general larger hive data set of legal, I think there's very much a place of that. I think it's artificially been propped up in the way that it has, and it's time to bring that down.
Yeah, what really well put, and I very much agree. James, yeah, what do you think about these things?
Yeah, I think Yev had some really great thoughts. I think the one thing that I might add is, we live in this age of incredible technological advancement. And the one thing that we have not been able to upgrade, it seems, is the human operating system, right? We're still going to disagree. We're still going to get in fights. But there are things that we can do to set ourselves up for success. And that's why I'm such a big advocate of the cooperative forum and of user ownership. It's because when humans get along better when incentives are aligned. And right now, in many organizations, incentives between various players in the ecosystem are not aligned. They're misaligned. And when that happens, that human hardware doesn't allow us to get along or work together well. And so one thing that I really love about user ownership is that it can align the interests of the users, it can align the interests of investors, so that users are supporting the value proposition of VCs, and VCs are supporting the value proposition of users. I think that AI has an incredible amount of potential to help around the edges, especially within these human relationships. But at the end of the day, we have to be thinking really hard about how we relate to one another and how the legal structures that we work within change the way we treat one another. And so, that's been one of our big focuses in this space, is trying to help everybody win.
Yeah, it's such a good point, where how our legal structures, pattern themselves into winners and losers has been something that preoccupies me, often. And these structural analyses that I guess historically we call critical legal theory, and then we saw the evolution of law in the US take on and continues to take in legal academia hard studies, now data-driven studies that show things like structural bias inside the public legal system. And I do worry, and again, this sort of picking up on some points that Mikael made in his piece right before us, where there is bias, it can come from coding, the cultural bias of people writing the rules. Sure, we know that. I mean, I think that's something that at least we can be mindful of. But I was really interested to hear Mikhail say that even in these networks, there's sort of a philosophy, or I'm using the wrong word now, but a meta pattern, a psychology that begins to emerge in these networks. And I think the legal system and common law system and structural bias that exists in the public legal economy now is proof of that same phenomena, and so as we start to think about coding rules and smart contract systems to try and make governance a bit more automatic, a bit more, bright line or efficient when it comes to business transactions, it creates even more of a risk in my mind for us to hard code the same structural injustices that the current system has, because we would say, well, that's how it works now, so shouldn't that be allowed? And I mentioned this in sort of setting this up to loop us back to thinking about public regulators. And we also, at least I used to do some work lobbying against big tobacco when I was doing work. I was a lobbyist in DC for a little while. And it's known, I mean, it's sort of factually accepted that that our administrative agencies can get captured by corporate interests. To what extent are regulators now perhaps sometimes chasing the interests of very large market players, and where our private system and governance we can create inside DAOs can perhaps even better regulate what we need than the public system? It becomes really interesting. I think we're starting to run short on time. And so I realize I'm chatting so much with the setup. I want to just maybe turn it over to get your thoughts on how you think this Web3 decentralized power of cooperatives and sort of governance can actually help us improve perhaps even the same types of questions and things that public regulators are sort of tasked to solve.
Yeah, great question. Just to draw one very quick historical analogy, back in the 1840s in the Industrial Revolution in England, people were not being cared for who were working in these big mills. They needed to help themselves. They were pushed out, they were poor, they were unable to provide, so they formed cooperatives in order to help themselves. We need to be doing the same thing today. We need to, you're right, sometimes regulation can take a long time. Congress can take a long time to act. And a cooperative can be a way to help ourselves. It can be a way that we can organize to protect ourselves by providing products that we're in charge of ourselves. And so, that is another one of the key drivers and why, Web3 holds a lot of potential. It's because we can create our own protections when other sources, when other protectors will not step in.
Yeah, well, very well put. Yeah, any other
thoughts? Just a final thought to tag on what James said, but I'm really curious about self-regulatory organizations, especially in the financial space, the fintech space. I think that there's room for a lot more SROs than what we currently have. Even like what we have with government appointed, SRO or government sanctioned, I guess, SROs for broker dealers, for other licensed professionals and brokered professionals. So I think that the same can sort of arise with the use of co-ops, with the use of kind of combining, these private organizations to influence public interests. And, you could have federated co-ops that are regional based, district based, and that can kind of come together under one umbrella to drive policy. And I'd like to see a lot more of that, actually.
Amazing. I think, Thomas, let me know. I think we're probably out of time.
We are.
Okay, great.
Well, we are and we are not, because we still would like to allow the audience to ask a few questions before we go there. First of all, I really have to thank Yev and James being here. Thank you very much. And Chris, I can tell you, over the last year, all three of you have educated us, and particularly myself, around DAOs and the opportunities like never before. I was not an expert a year ago. I didn't even know what a DAO was last October. So let's be real. I learned a lot, and there were two big takeaways here right now. And I have to say, one is James mentioned earlier, which is actually so true, right? A DAO is a business owned by its members. And it's like, wow, isn't that the most obvious thing that we all should thrive for in general? And the second one, on a personal note, being German, I had no idea about the Bundesliga example. That is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So before we go to the questions, I literally want to ask you, if all of us have a clean plate, what does it take, and why isn't it happening that we are all over and creating as many DAOs as possible as fast as we can? I would really like to hear like a 1-minute answer before we go into the Q&A. I don't get it, because it seems so good, almost too good to be true. What's missing?
I have my answer to that question, and it's not the only answer. There may be other answers, but I think that user-owned organizations, member-owned organizations, have always had a hard time just getting started, and they need capital in order to get started. You would never have Twitter if you didn't have an investor with a lot of money come in and get it going. And I think the problem has been that once a big company like Twitter or X now gets going, there's never a transition to user ownership. That transition just never happens. And so I think the key differentiator here could be the ability to transition from investor ownership at the outset of a new business. That transition from investor ownership over to community ownership incrementally. And I think if we can do that, then I think a lot more companies can start looking like DAOs. But
so capitalism is in the way?
I don't think capitalism is in the way. I think that capitalism is the way that so much of this gets started. I think what's in the way might be our lack of legal creativity.
Okay.
Our ability to think outside the box and think about how ownership should change over time. And I think that's something that the legal community hasn't thought enough about. How when a product grows, it needs to transition to a more community-based user ownership model. And VCs can be rewarded for that, right? VCs are not just giving up their ownership. They could sell their ownership to the users of a platform. They could incentivize greater engagement by selling to the users of a platform. And so there's really the ability for everybody to win here. And I think we just need to start thinking about business differently as something where you start with capital and you transition over to community.
Okay, thank you very much. For the sake of time, let's move over to the Q&A. I would like to give the audience an opportunity. If Sonia is online and you can throw a few questions to the panelists, I would be appreciated.
Yes. So one question from the audience regarding the ethical use of data. How can we ensure ethical, good use of our data will be resolved with blockchain? Or can it be resolved through blockchain technology?
I'm happy I've thought a lot about this, particularly as it connects to the intellectual property that exists on blockchain. There's no way blockchain won't solve issues of violence and crime and things where people can take advantage of vulnerable situations, by no means. But where I think it can improve ethical compliance is by enabling more transparency across supply chains that use value that we all create. And so, for example, going back to intellectual property being perhaps one of the most ubiquitous assets in the global economy, if you tokenized every piece of intellectual property, put it on blockchain, and included in that tokenization and in a model ethical constraints that conditions one's ability to use the IP upon one's compliance with those ethics, you can actually create an efficient system, in my mind, that enables one to, or at least a more efficient system than we currently have with the IP system, And what happens is when you detect an ethical violation, which means you haven't been able to prevent it, but when you detect one, you can now wield a whole mountain of IP risk that is where one loses the license to this IP that they used because they violated the ethical conditions. Well, now they lose their license to the IP. And if you want to see big corporations change their behavior more quickly than any other way possible, put them into intellectual property disputes. You know, look at how much big tech shapes its behavior around patent disputes. Intellectual property is one of the few things that scares companies even more than things like human rights abuses or labor abuses. Those are much actually more difficult to enforce for a host of reasons. But international trade with intellectual property, that has real teeth to it. Connect those to ethics, and I think you have a better system.
Jeff, your thoughts?
I'm not an IP lawyer, but I do think that Chris eloquently kind of put it together. I think that the more players that you bring in terms of, you know, creating these data sets from the get-go and owning those data sets, whether in a cooperative or some other model like a DAO, the more that you can start thinking through these challenges and these ethical concerns at the very outset, and once you sort of are seeding that data. And now, you know, with technological advancement, including blockchain, there's so many more ways to kind of retain that control. So it's not just out in the wild. So you're not just defending like a fair use doctrine type claim or, you know, whatever it is that is totally out of control. So I guess even though we have all these decentralized models, the control can still be maintained, right? And that's what's really appealing to me. And I think that would, you know, it'd be a good solution for maintaining ethics around these data sets.
Maybe one more question, Sonia?
Sure, we just had one question come in from Mehdi Hamedi. So how can normal generic, like the general public, make financial benefits from the required backbone infrastructure of Web3 rather than just subsurface exchange applications? So how can the general public financially benefit from the infrastructure that's taking place around Web3?
I like that question. Go ahead. Who wants to take that on?
Well, I don't know if there's any one right or wrong answer. I think there are probably multiple answers. You know, I think that in the world of tokenization, at least speaking within the United States, the way to make money from Web3 has been by buying and selling tokens for a higher price. Part of the reason is that in order to avoid classification of tokens as a security, generally you cannot distribute, you can't make distributions from a business with respect to that token, because that's sort of like the fundamental definition of a security. One nice thing about co-ops is that you can make distributions, you can share financial benefits with the community based on people's participation. And those distributions are, they don't lead to the cooperative membership being classified as a security. So again, there's no one right or wrong answer here. I think there are multiple approaches that can work. I do think, however, that if you want to make distributions to your community for the contributions that they make, if you want to share that upside, then there are ways that are simpler than simply issuing a security or issuing a token that doesn't have any sort of distribution rights attached to it.
Odd. I mean, I like the example of, I know that NFTs have come into light more recently with some of the SEC actions that make them resemble securities. But I do think that NFTs can be a very powerful use case for artists, right? With music, with art and royalties that are built into the way that NFT is created. So I think that that's a wonderful use case of how disintermediation has occurred in this space with those players that have typically relied on multiple intermediaries that take a cut of their revenue.
Okay, on that note, I would like to send a big thank you to all of you, Chris, for hosting, moderating this. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing your thoughts. And James, thank you very much, as always.
Thank you.
All of you have been incredibly helpful for us to define the right way with value in mind and the long-term creation of value for the AI developer community. And just for the people who are online right now, if you want to come back, if you stay along, which is even better, this afternoon at 3:25 p.m. Pacific time, we will be back on stage. Chris will join us as well. And we are officially going to launch the WOW DAO. And I sum up the conversation we have right now here. I can assure all of you that what we are launching is in the full interest of the AI developer community. And hence why I like, James, your comment earlier, which was a business owned by its members. That's what this is really all about. So with that, thank you very much. And I appreciate you being part of this summit. Thank you.